All right, let me ask, do I have your permission to record you?
Yes, you have my permission. I
Okay,
will want to give you further permission on what your transmission will be.
sure, sure. Today we have on the phone right now Professor Alison Holmes. She is the associate professor and leader of the program at the Humboldt Department of Political Science. She also writes at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. She has taught at Oxford, yes, the Oxford University. She was also a Pierre Keller Fellow in Transatlantic Studies and taught at Yale University. She was also the deputy head for corporate communication strategy at the BBC, helping to get it work. But most importantly, she has a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics, yes, that school, and she has worked for an American ambassador to the UK, and she teaches political science. Professor, is there something I got wrong, mispronounced? Is there other key criteria to establish
No,
your
actually, the
authority?
only thing I might slightly amend is that I sit in the politics department, but I actually run the international studies program. So it's an interdisciplinary major here at Humboldt State University, and so the program, the academic program that I run, is this slightly smaller interdisciplinary program called international studies. So that's the only thing I would slightly tweak, and I do sit in the politics department officially, but this is a program with its own set of criteria and its own requirements.
So you have a professional training in international relations. You have taught in other countries, and you worked for an ambassador, and now you teach in international studies. Is that fair?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, I just got to establish that so that people understand what's going on here. Now, recently, in August 2019, as part of the scholar program at Humboldt, you had a presentation on California as a nation state, innovative or inevitable. What was that about, Professor?
Well, it was the program at Sacramento State University, and that was where the presentation was as a visiting scholar. And the idea of the presentation was to have some responses from people who are experts in the field. So we had three respondents to the presentation. But really, the presentation and the goal of the presentation was to effectively report back on work I had been doing for the past year or so on California as a global actor. So my background in diplomacy, which you kindly mentioned, basically it got me interested in how diplomacy works and who is involved, and really about globalization and the theory of international relations, which really talks about state-to-state diplomacy more often, whereas globalization, I think, has really, in particular, issues like climate change, has meant that people like cities and counties and states, obviously the size of California, have been getting increasingly engaged on the international stage. And so I was interested in that. And sitting now in California, after 23 years in the United Kingdom, I was interested in that kind of diplomacy at that level. And what do we think about subnationals doing international work? And obviously, the UK has Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, so they also have some subnationals where this is also a very relevant question. So there are a lot of places where there are subnational actors who are doing more and more at the UN, engaging with each other, negotiating deals, and doing some very interesting things that traditionally international relations people would say is not their job. So that's what I got interested in doing.
So, roughly, what did you find in that presentation and throughout the last year of your work? I believe you had done interviews with just about everybody who currently or retired at high levels of the California government.
Well, basically, I tried focusing really, I would say, primarily on the diplomatic side. So I focused on the consuls general to California from the main trading states with California, so Mexico and Canada, China, Japan, the United Kingdom, Quebec. I also talked to some folks from Quebec. I talked to people from Scotland and Wales. Um, so I tried to cover a lot of the ground. Australia, I think I mentioned Japan, but basically I was trying to focus on the diplomatic side, and then I also interviewed a lot of the diplomats from the main countries in Washington, D.C., so I could get the Washington view, the California view, and then also, as you say, the state officials. So various people who work for the state of California in terms of international affairs. I interviewed a couple of governors, and really trying to get the sense of just asking everybody, how does California do in terms of their job of reaching out to you and as diplomats in their state, and also asking the officials how do they think about what their job is on the international stage and what their strategy is. And really what I found is that California does an amazing job, and as the fifth largest economy in the world, we're not shocked by this, but it's not very coordinated, and it's not very well organized. So, for example, San Francisco, Los Angeles has just appointed a deputy mayor of international affairs. San Diego has a sort of international trade zone. So people are doing a lot of interesting things, but because subnationals are not allowed to make treaties, they're not allowed to make binding things. There's a lot of MOUs, there are a lot of agreements, compacts, all kinds of different language that suggests that they're doing things, but A, we're not keeping track of it very well because it's not as formal as a treaty. It may or may not be binding, depending on whether or not the state comes in behind and creates implementation for these agreements. And also nobody tells anybody else what they've done. So very few people know that the deals that Los Angeles has done in Japan or wherever may also affect what San Diego does. I was just at a recent conference where someone from San Diego sort of confessed to San Francisco that they actually had a trade office in San Francisco trying to get people to come to San Diego from San Francisco. It's like, that seems like something that somebody might want to know. And I'm also particularly interested in the issue of sovereignty. So the difference between traditional sovereignty and what's considered inherent or tribal sovereignty. So I would say the other thing I found was that, in fact, it would be very helpful in terms of thinking about economic development or even global international relations is to make sure that the tribes have representation on those kinds of groups, because we have government-to-government relations between California and the tribes, and yet they are in a sort of separate, parallel universe when it comes to a lot of the things we're doing internationally. But they are also doing a huge number of things internationally. So just to use a local example, the Yurok tribe here in Northern California has declared the Klamath River as a person, which is an initiative that came from another part of the world. So they are very globally connected. And again, we're not sort of I don't want to say controlling, but just coordinating and collaborating as much as we could or should if we want to try and have, or do we want to try and have international affairs in some wider sense than just economic development? And also, how do we get the different levels of governance to be more interconnected? A lot of diplomatic theory will tell you that really networked diplomacy is where it's at, whereas we still operate very much in silos. And so all these different silos are reaching out to the international arena by themselves, when in fact, if we want to be truly networked, the best practice, the innovation of subnationals is really to be a more networked system. And California is doing it in terms of international action, but they're not doing it in terms of connecting sideways, both up and down, to all of the different other actors who are doing similar kinds of activity.
I want to read a quote from an article you were interviewed for, I believe, 2019. Professor ponders California's independent future. Quote, they've been going and doing stuff with China, Mexico, and Canada. It's like, wait, you're not supposed to do that. That's not what international relations theory says. It's not what the U.S. Constitution says. It's not what all of the other rules suggest. Holmes spent her sabbatical last school year researching California and talking with state officials and those the state has dealt with. In August, Holmes presented her research to the Center for California Studies at Sacramento State University, called California's Nation-State, Innovative or Inevitable. In her research, Holmes found that cities and industries within California may act internationally, but the state itself doesn't typically act as a known nation. Quotes, we do things internationally, but we don't do them coordinated. Is that roughly what you were? Is that a fair summary?
I hope that's what I try to use not the exact same language every time I say it, but I think that's the crux of what I found is that we have lots of different. I also had the honor of attending the San Francisco Climate Action Summit. And at that summit, that was something that also struck me very forcefully there is the number of subnational actors who were doing great work and very innovative work on the issue of climate change, and yet they weren't coordinating it even with people in their own country or their own, in our case, the state of California, and at different levels. And so I guess as somebody who worries about what happens in 5 years when you change hands or governments, someone else comes into power and nobody wrote it down, and nobody, or they say wrote it down, they didn't share it with somebody else who's affected or impacted by what you've done. And I worry when people aren't leaving those breadcrumbs for other people. It feels like we lose progress when we don't make it stronger by making it more institutionalized. And that's really what I guess I was intrigued by. But as you said, I came from the world of international relations, so traditional sovereignty is very clear that subnationals aren't really supposed to go running around doing things with other governments. They might do it with another subnational. There are the Länder in Germany might come, Bavaria might come and talk to California, and that's not so unusual. But you're not necessarily supposed to go and talk to the Chancellor of Germany or the President of another country and do deals with them at that level as a subnational. International relations theory is not very well equipped for thinking about these different kinds of sovereignty. It has a very traditional, I don't want to say rigid, but certainly not very flexible idea of what a sovereign looks like. And without recognition from other people, your sovereignty is compromised. You only have internal sovereignty. And that's the real challenge when you come to the question between a state's sovereignty, as in the United States, or the state sovereignty of California, or the sovereignty of the Yurok tribe, is there's incredibly different ideas of what their rights and their responsibilities are as a sovereign. But what I argued is that globalization has meant that all of our different definitions are now all crowded together, particularly when you get to the international space. And so, for example, tribes don't have the same voice at the United Nations as the United States, because it is an intergovernmental organization. And even interestingly, cities almost have more voice than the state of California, because cities have been involved in a UN initiative. So there's a very interesting jumping over, piggybacking of what kind of recognition different international institutions are giving different levels of governance. And I think that that's sort of a bigger question for IR theory, but it's also for the state of California, because a lot of the lines run through state government. Cities, counties, tribes, the state of California, international governance, national governance run through Sacramento. And so it's a divining rod, or a ley line of these things that come through Sacramento, and they have to deal with all these different levels, and trying to say that at least our external face could stand some coordination. And that's what the diplomats told me as well. They're frustrated sometimes that officials from Sacramento don't come to. Los Angeles is the largest concentration of a consular corps outside New York City,
right,
I think, in the world. And so the idea that officials from Sacramento don't come to Los Angeles to talk to the international community, there's not if you go to the California website and try and find who's in charge of international stuff, it's sort of diffused through a lot of different places. Governor Newsom has done some changes. He's actually specifically given his lieutenant governor the job of international affairs. He's added that to the economic portfolio, Eleni Kalinakis. And the idea that he has added that, just even the phrase international affairs, to what is traditionally the business, which is economic development, is a big move. And it's exactly what Mayor Garcetti did when he appointed Nina Hachigian, a former ambassador, as is the lieutenant governor, also a former ambassador. It says something about they understand we need to be global, but it still doesn't quite give the manpower and the resources to say we need to pull some of this stuff a little, not in tight formation, but we at least need to be checking in and networking with each other and understanding that these silos will harm us ultimately if we don't have an overall strategy. Abe Lowenthal, Mark Ballecer, Douglas Smur have all written about California and it not quite getting globalness. I mean, it loves its globalness, it thinks it's global, but when it really comes right down to it, it doesn't coordinate it, and it doesn't have a strategy. And I think that that's kind of what I've been suggesting. You mentioned my USD blogs from public diplomacy point of view, trying to say that, in fact, California needs to sit down and have a hard to think about how you organize that external side and your interests as a state in a way that is the best foot forward for California, and that is actually global in a world in which that is what will matter. International is not nearly now as important as being global, and those are different things.
I'm familiar with Abraham Lowenthal in Global California Rising to the Cosmopolitan Challenge. Who were the other two authors you just named that were also investigating this issue?
Oh, well, actually, these are all about 10, 15. I mean, we keep coming around to this question, and they all keep saying the same observation. Mark Baldassare is actually the CEO of the PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of
Okay,
California,
yeah,
and he wrote a book like back in 2000. It was California into the Millennium, or
okay,
I can't quite remember the exact title. And Douglas Smur wrote an article. He is actually he worked for a law firm in Sacramento, but he was the last head of the California office, Trade Office, Economic Development Office in Mexico City before it got closed. He also happens to be married to the Consul General from Mexico to Sacramento. So his experience with trade and economic development and running a California office, which is now that's a rare breed of person who remembers those, is he wrote an article basically saying there are these important lessons that California has not learned. And he was writing just as that office was being closed, and so he was feeling very concerned that California needed to sort of take a step and look at what their strategy was, and he was worried that it didn't look as if they had been able to pull together an actual strategy.
so I'd like to read a quote. New Globalism, an open letter to California's new governor, January 2019, 1 year ago, written by Alison Holmes. For too long, California has been a reluctant global player, a kind of accidental internationalist, dealing with issues only to the extent necessary and usually in reaction to domestic business sustainability demands. The state has worked to not attract undue attention to the global arena per se, and certainly has not created a permanent infrastructure that could deal with its growing global interests. Governor, I warn you that some people, perhaps even on your team, will argue that you do not have the time or resources to review, or let alone build, a bespoke structure for the state's international affairs. Professor Holmes, what was the reaction of California government officials? Did people get that we were losing a gigantic opportunity? Basically, when you're describing this, I pictured LA, San Francisco, Sacramento as tentacles on an octopus without the body. It's going to look like chaos. Do people get this, or are they saying, well, that's a theoretical concept? Yeah, it sounds interesting. Or do they get that we're losing out big time by not coordinating the activities to outreach in a global economy, being the world's fifth largest part of it?
Well, I would say that the reaction was, and that was actually written on the day of his inauguration, and so I'm pretty sure he was not reacting directly to me, but already had an inclination to be a very global governor. As you saw, he ended up taking foreign trips, and he created this office that I just referred to, that the lieutenant governor is now.
Thank you.
This committee that she's chairing, and the change in the title, and reactivating this part of the portfolio and giving that to a person to try and coordinate. And I would say that they are busy trying to work out. It is a year just over on, and so you got to give these folks some time. It's a big ship to try and gather these things together. But I would say that I'm pretty sure he didn't do it just because I suggested it. But I am sure that it is
Right.
something that he was uh, aware of and working on. But it is not an easy thing to try and shift. And so I think that there is more work to be done. Obviously, there always is. But I would also say that I don't expect it to just be, it's not a formation. You can't get these people to fly like the red arrows or anything. That's not going to happen, because globalization doesn't work like that. Tentacles of an octopus may be a good analogy, but if you're doing it well, there is a brain behind the tentacles, and you can let them go and do whatever they want to do, as long as they kind of have a strategy and some priorities, and they keep each other in touch. One tentacle doesn't know what the other tentacles are doing is not the rest of the analogy that you want to have going on. You want to
Right.
know what tentacle 1 is doing, and tentacle 4 is
Right.
doing, and tentacle 8 is doing.
Right.
That's the way to let it work. But you can't make them. The octopus also can't swim if things can't flow freely around. So you don't want them to be all locked together. You want them to at least be aware of what else is out there and what we're all sort of edging towards with priorities and a strategy. And I think that's as much as one can hope for. I for a different project, interviewed the Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in London. And because the U.S.-UK relationship is so involved and so intense, I asked him about, how does he coordinate all of the things that come from the U.S. all the time? He said, I'm not that type A of personality. I can't control it, and I don't want to control it. All I want to do is know that everybody's pushing in the right direction, and then I have to let people just get on with what their jobs are, because they know so much more about what they're doing than I do. But I have to trust that they'll keep me in the loop and that we're all pushing the same way. But he doesn't have enough hours in his life, and I think that California, being now larger than the UK economy, is in the same position of not being able to control everybody doing this stuff, but trusting that everybody's doing their bit to the same tune. And I think that that's part of the challenge for the lieutenant governor and the governor and all the people who work in the state apparatus, as well as all the diplomats who have to try and puzzle out how the state of California wants them to operate. Like, am I a favored country? Does California want to talk to me? Am I a pest? And even knowing that means that they could start adjusting their strategies, because it would be in tune with California's strategy. And I think that would be useful for also all the diplomats who are here as well. I think that some, obviously, like Mexico, absolutely know that they're at the top of the list. Like, it would be foolish not to have Mexico at the top of the list, or Canada. But, hey, I'm France, or I'm all these other countries.
Right, right.
I'm Azerbaijan.
I should be number one.
My role here?
No, I should be number one.
Well, I don't think they all think they should be number one, but they want to know if they're not even remotely on the radar.
Fair enough.
They want to know that they will have their day at some other point, but it's not right now, or it's not as consistent, or the services they get are sort of in tier 3, not tier 1, or however you want to try and phrase it. Without being pejorative or putting anybody down, it's sort of an awareness of California has decided that it wants to build its relationship with, I'll pick Luxembourg out of the sky for absolutely no good reason.
Okay.
But I'll just say Luxembourg for fun, because
Sure.
It's the example I use with my students. But if Luxembourg knew that California has a new tourism strategy with Luxembourg, then they would know what their job in the story was. They would know how to be sending the right people. They would know that they were talking to the right agency. They would have a sense of how they were chiming into the strategy. And it's hard to deal with an entity if you don't know where the entity is trying to go or what it's trying to do.
Right. So let me ask you, if I could. So it sounds like you're saying high levels of California government get that we need to be coordinated, and Gavin Newsom is making some serious efforts to do that. It's going to take some time to see some results, but he's really trying, and he gets it. And he brought in a ringer. I mean, Eleni is, I think she was a diplomat to Hungary for years, exceptionally brilliant, good experience. The question I have is, did the officials in the cities agree that coordination's good? I mean, is LA saying, yeah, you're right, we should coordinate, and San Francisco gets it in Sacramento? Or are we seeing where the Sacramento says so, and then the cities are saying, well, I don't know, I kind of like doing my own thing? What was your findings?
Well, I would actually say that the Deputy Mayor of International Affairs for Los Angeles, Nina Hachigian, actually said, well, if we had a functioning State Department, the State Department would be helping coordinate what states are doing, what cities are doing, what counties are doing.
Nice.
But in the absence of a State Department that cares about intergovernmental and or international relations from the subnational to other countries, then she would like to see some coordination at the state level. So my impression is that the city of Los Angeles, as big and huge and mega city powerful as it is, would kind of like to know what everybody else is doing. Like, if there's some way I don't have to try and do everything myself, it's like, wow, sliced bread, what a great idea. But if somebody's already done it, then we don't really need to invent it again. Or if California has an in with another country or another, if they've got a network system working. And actually, that was what I really found at the Climate Change Summit. A lot of people in the climate change issue thought that they had just invented the wheel. And a lot of people who I spoke to about the National Association of Counties, the National League of Cities, all said, the climate change people, they're a special issue. They're a single issue group. They think they just invented all these networks. These networks have existed. Sister cities, different organizations for local government people, all these things have existed for like decades, most of them since about the turn of the century. But now that you've got an issue to hang on that level of governance, particularly at the city level, there were a little bit of frustration. They love that everybody's gotten on the bandwagon, but there's a little frustration at the idea that because climate change came along, everybody suddenly created new networks. Their point was actually they reinvented networks that already existed, and actually we spent a lot of time trying to reconnect it to the things that already exist. Rather than working with what was there, they did create some new networks, but actually it was kind of a waste of effort. I mean, not exactly a waste because they did stuff, but it was also kind of a parallel effort. It's like, we really don't have time to make parallel efforts every time we have a bright idea. The next one would be human trafficking and human rights. Let's have a whole bunch of city networks around that. It's like, you have a city network. Why don't we use it and say, we're going to do some of our work on this, we'll do some of our work on that, we will make sure that we're all coordinated, and then you don't have to keep reinventing these other networks that are the climate change city network, the human rights city network, and that makes it, we slow ourselves down by not at least knowing that we have a network we could use. It may not be exactly fit to purpose, in which case create a new one by all means. But if you could have used the one that already existed, or that you could have added power to that network by your own presence and issue, then that seems like a more efficient way to try and get all the stuff done in the world that we need to get done.
Yeah, I was shocked when California had trade offices since, I believe, the 70s. They were shuttered by Governor Schwarzenegger due to the recession, and we're just now opening them back up, 10 of them, 10 different countries under the Lieutenant Governor, Eleni, I always get her last name wrong, Kounalakis, who's an experienced ambassador, and I encourage everybody to look at her, look at the 10 trade offices that are being opened, look at the legislation that created that, because if you look at the original legislation, they changed it, but the original legislation, I believe by Hueso, made it look like these were close to embassies. Now, they moved away from that language, but I encourage everybody to go look for yourself. And also take a look at the lieutenant governor's description created by Gavin Newsom, and then compare that to a traditional Secretary of State definition. I'm not going to give you conclusions. Just take a look. I think you'll find, wow, there's a lot of similarities there. And to back up what the professor's saying, Gavin Newsom's had a definite international focus. He went to Latin America, spoke on Univision, and told them, quotes, consider California having a separate foreign policy from America. Professor, does Gavin Newsom want to make us a separate nation? I think BBC slightly tongue-in-cheek joked around about this a few months ago, but when we look at the fact that the man proposed a United Nations Climate Change Center in San Francisco as mayor in 2009, has traveled the world, and right after he got inaugurated, he went to Latin America on Spanish TV and told them, consider us as having a separate foreign policy. What's going on? What do you feel? What are you seeing?
Well, I think certainly there's also a lot of domestic politics going on as well. I think that the notion that California is trying to pull the tail of President Trump is not a secret. I think that they've been bringing a lot of legal cases against the federal government. The federal government has itself called California a rogue state, which gives it a lot of kudos for being as powerful as that little moniker suggests. But I think that it's an interesting question how you try and work out how far you want to go or can go. California doesn't have national interests. When we talk in international relations theory, we talk about, France having in the national interest of France. Obviously, California doesn't have national interests. We also don't have a lot of the responsibilities that a federal government has. We are off the hook for a lot of the costs of being a federal government. So the notion of it trying to say we have a different foreign policy, I would say that that's different than saying we have state interests that have international impact. It has international repercussions, and not having an interest in a global perspective will have repercussions back on our state. And so when I was interviewing Governor Brown, I was really struck because, of course, as the climate change governor, one thinks of that as being a very progressive, international, global issue. But really, he kept insisting that it was because he is very local in his focus. To deliver for the people of California, he had to go to allies and friends and stakeholders in the rest of the world. His global mission was to bring the benefits back to California. He was incredibly locally focused. And I think that that shows in the way he set up his international effort, in that it was all about sustainability. It wasn't called international, and that's what I meant when I put in the letter to Governor Newsom, is that they're kind of accidental internationalists. It was like, I have an issue. It's about California, but I have to go talk to people in other parts of the world to do what I want to do back home.
Yeah.
And that's not the same as saying, I want to be engaged with the world in all of the different ways that we are global and connected. And that, I think, is a slightly different perspective, and how Newsom plays that will be a very big question, because part of it is he's also a young man in a hurry. He will,
Right.
what his political future is has got a lot to say to whether or not and how he presents his international agenda. But it's also, international issues are not stage management, and that's part of what I think states have a hard time remembering, is that I can go rampaging around and make statements that are quite inflammatory in many ways, or stage politics, symbolic politics, but that's actually not foreign affairs. That is not being a responsible international player. That's student politics on an international scale, and that is problematic in terms of the long-term consequences of making those kinds of statements, either at home or abroad. And the reason foreign policy moves so slowly is because your words stay with you forever. When you do things, you can't suddenly switch gear with Luxembourg or Japan or France or Mexico or Canada. You can't switch gears on them. And therefore what you say will last a long time. That's why binding treaties are binding treaties. That's why the national government holds it to the national government, because they are binding the country forever to do whatever it is they said they were going to do. And that is something that is, the founding fathers felt that was something that a subnational should not be able to do, because it could run counter to the national interest.
Interesting.
Right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's a reason why treaties are not, that they are considered the law of the land, and
Right.
they are made at the national level. They have no higher, we have no higher law than treaties. And so one should not, I'm not saying people don't, and currently we have some interesting things going on, but they should not be entered into lightly. And that is why having subnationals, for the sake of argument, running around making treaties with people is like, no, because that could be counter to the national interest, and the national interest is what ultimately matters in terms of the Constitution. And so there's a whole level of complication in terms of saying things that we know are counter to national policy, and at the same time wanting to say our values as a state, our ideas of what is important, climate change is an existential threat, we want to take specific and immediate action on these issues. How do you operate in that space as a state and as a subnational with the tools that you have that are legal for a start, but also that seem to be in keeping without actually putting other things at threat?
But I'd like to ask, though, in your presentation, it's called California as a Nation State, Innovative or Inevitable. And I certainly hear you. California is not officially a nation. It can't sign treaties, etc. However, I'd like to ask your opinion about a couple things. So, Governor Brown 5 times, to the Chinese, to the Irish, to other American states, said, go ahead and consider us a separate nation. Oh, I'm just kidding. But he made that joke 5 times. Additionally, when he traveled to Paris in a rebuke of Donald Trump to cobble together a coalition of different cities and formal countries, Politico, which is not a silly organization, that is a well-established, serious political magazine, had an article, and I'm not making this up, called Jerry Brown, President of the Independent Republic of California. And that serious political magazine was saying, wow, this guy's pulling together cities, nations. He meets with prime ministers. He's moving the world on climate change, independent of America. We go back to Governor Schwarzenegger. He said California's a nation state, and now we have Governor Newsom who's also saying that. At what point do we cross the line and we have a California that's basically acting like a nation?
Well, I think that nation state is an important distinction in international relations terms. To call back to my roots here, is a nation. California has problems being that. That is a lot of not just empty rhetoric, but it is certainly a rhetorical point in that nations, the almost definition to be a secessionist nation is Quebec, or arguably other places in the world who want to be secessionist on the basis of homogeneity of the people, the culture, the language, the history of that people. California's great claim, which is actually a point that I made both in that talk and in various other articles that I've written, is California's problem is it doesn't remotely fit that definition of a nation. Our diversity is actually probably the most exciting part about the state, but that means that we've already opted out of being a nation. Like we're wrong to be a nation. We're not. The diversity, you don't get to claim nationhood on the basis of diversity. That is the antithesis of a nation. Some authors have tried to turn it around and call it a state nation. And I think that might be helpful just because it puts the nation part as a sense of feeling and sentiment about. Then I might be able to see my way clear to say actually the state nation is one that we've tried to make diversity as the basis of our affinity for each other. But in fact, what you actually see under the surface in California is a great deal of split identity politics, and its biggest challenge is precisely that one. So I think why do governors call it a nation state is I think because they're trying to put the straw together to make bricks of nationness out of diversity, and that has been the challenge for the United States since its founding. Is how do we not cleaving along the lines of our difference, but how do we find that some things are bigger, transcendent, more important, our ideas of rule of law, individual freedom, freedom of speech, all these kinds of things that we think are what bind us as a country, and that's far bigger than the idea that Governor Brown or Governor Newsom want to pull the tail of a president who they don't agree with ultimately. And actually, the things that California doesn't have to pay for because it is within a federal union, California can be and has been in precarious financial shape in the past, and the idea that it would suddenly pay for all the things that are part of our union is a huge ask in terms of how you should suddenly suggest that we would have a really separate foreign policy, or that we would really actually break away in some fundamental way. You don't get to enjoy the benefits without actually taking the responsibility for what that would be. And I think that, yes, as the fifth largest economy in the world or whatever, there's a lot of way, but homelessness, poverty, the inequalities within the state of California are bigger than almost any state in the union at this point. And I think that would mean that if you said that we were a separate country, we would be outraged by those statistics even more than we are as a state of California. And so I think that, and the exodus out of California for reasons of taxation and not being able to afford to live here are things that are serious concerns for the governor. And so I think that the international strategy can be a huge part of redressing those issues and bringing more prosperity to the state so that we can be both more connected to each other but also more connected to the world. And I think that would be, not to pun, but capitalizing on the diversity, and then the diversity makes sense. It connects us globally in a way that means that diversity is binding, not diversity as divisive. And that's the root of diversity is division. And I think that the biggest challenge is trying to make it into something that's focusing on the second half, which is the unity part, as opposed to the focusing on the first part, which is the division part. And that is a huge challenge for any governor of the state, and has been for some time. But I think that global can be the glue, and I think that it would help us bind tribes into our stakeholders and bind cities and counties in the state together. I like to think that global can be binding. It doesn't have to be about diversity or division between levels.
Well, let me ask you two questions. So, California, part of America, doesn't qualify for being a nation, given the way most nations are made. Why then did America get to be a nation? They were English speaking, English cultured. American differentiation and talking didn't happen until 100 years later. Why do Americans get to say, yeah, we speak the same language, have the same history, have the same customs, but we have this concept called freedom, and you don't, and that's good enough for us to be independent. Could Californians lay claim to the fact that California values, as espoused by Kevin De Leon and the governor, and supported, I think, by 65% of the California voters, also be considered a concept that makes them different enough?
Well, there's lots of different pieces. I think part of it is that Californians like to feel that they lead the country, but the rest of the country doesn't want to be led by California.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. No one
Um,
ever brings that up. Thank
oh
you.
well, but it's I my students have to study abroad as part of the program at this university, and it takes about 5 minutes in any conversation about how is your study abroad before somebody raises the fact that they stopped saying they were from the United States or that they were American and started to say that they were from California.
Thank you. I've
The
heard
rest
that many times from people who travel. Again, you're the first professor I've heard to actually say that.
Oh well, it's what my students tell me. It's not something I said. It's what I got reported back to me by students who are from California, and they go around the world, and they tell me what happens to them. And so it's me I'm just reporting.
Sure.
But I think what is intriguing about that is the notion that California wants to be innovative, and that's really where the title of that talk came from. California is convinced it is incredibly innovative, and in many ways it is. But in many ways, that also shows how actually it can be very parochial at the same time. As I said about networks and people talking about climate change, and everybody thinks that we invented it. It's like, well, actually, other people in other parts of the world have been working on climate change long before the Americans ever woke up to the idea that this was a problem.
Sure.
The
Sure.
what we call the deep green and the light green movements in Germany was there in the 70s and 80s. So the idea that somehow California and or the United States or whatever, it's that we woke up slowly because we are a big, fascinating, wasteful, energetic, innovative, arrogant, self-centered state country, and we don't quite see what a hegemon's privilege is. And we are a hegemon of states within the United States, and the United States is a hegemon among countries in the world. And the problem of being a hegemon is you are the bull in the china shop. You just don't see. You assume that whenever you thought it up, why do you think we call it the World Series? Nobody else plays
Thank
baseball.
you. Thank you.
It's not a but it's an understandable. I often tell an anecdote to my students about the first time I traveled by train across Europe, and of course, um, my French was appalling, and so we were in a couchette, these little train carriages, and we were all being super polite to each other about open the window, using lots of, very slowly, speaking politely. And then the next morning, after we'd all slept on this train overnight, and we were looking disheveled, and you stagger out of the compartment, and two of the other people who'd gotten off and gotten on the train in completely different countries were chatting in English out in the hallway. I was furious that they had not shared the fact that we could have been chatting in English across several countries of Europe by this stage. And their reasoning was Americans should learn a foreign language.
Nice.
And I said, yes, you're absolutely right. We should all learn more foreign languages. But here, let me tell you, all the time that we've been on this train, we've managed to have a country that has one language and one currency. I would not have gone over borders. I would not need my passport. I would not need another currency, and I would not have had as many wars. So, back at ya. It's like we are kind of inbuilt lazy, but there are some fascinatingly wonderful things about our country that have made us that way. The question is, how do we challenge ourselves to not get as lazy as we have become? Or how do we get out of our laziness to think that actually other people have been doing these things far longer than we have? And I think that that's part of what is cool about being big and a hegemon in some ways. How do you use your hegemonic power?
Right.
And I think that that's a recognition of authority and responsibility and accountability. And I think California has this great position that I think Governor Brown used really well about saying, I can be a leader on this issue. But single issue politics is not a trade policy. It is not a human rights policy. It is not a lot of things to say I've got one issue and I judge everything by that single issue. And in fact, one of the California officials I spoke to said, it's great, but it's not a foreign policy. It's
Right.
a single issue, and you
Right.
can't run a foreign policy on the basis if I only judge it by one criteria. Are you helping me do what I want to do on climate change? Well,
Right. Right.
that is a balance that every leader of every country of the world has to make every day. How do I balance this issue against that one and that one and that one? How do I balance my economic development against human rights concerns? How do I balance more jobs in the rural areas of my state against, poverty in the urban areas? How do I balance these things? And you can't have just one test. And in local politics, we all know that. But when we go abroad, Governor Brown had an excellent, razor-sharp focus and did amazing work on that issue. Is that a foreign policy? Going to El Salvador and talking about the reasons of migration. And when they said to Governor Newsom, we want more jobs, bring us economic development, he said, yeah, sure, come and do business in California. That's not I can't give you aid. We can't give aid to people.
Right. Right. So we're limited.
So he got suddenly stymied as his own, I thought, his own question, which is like, we migrate because we're poor. So help us with economic development or aid. He's like, well, no, sorry. I'm the state of California. I can't do that. But gosh, isn't it great that I came and highlighted this issue?
Fair enough. Fair enough. So we don't have the actual structures there, and your study, again, for everybody, you can go to YouTube, California is a nation state, innovative or inevitable, and I totally agree. You have all these efforts, they're not coordinated. If we're going to do more, and not just for our own economy, but to help other countries, we got to get coordinated. We need to do this. I would.
Well, I think when we have a strategy, I think that then everybody can coordinate with it. I think it's not so much necessarily the coordination part. That sort of smacks of flying in formation and telling people to coordinate. What I would say is if I start to sing a song, you can sing along. And I think that's it's a more collaborative image. It's like if California wrote itself a little song and started to sing it, and everybody knew it, we can all sing along. I can either opt out of singing it, I can add my instrument to it, but at least I would know what you were doing, and I could coordinate around you. And it's like all I can do is do what I'm doing, and other people can join me or not. But I think that if you don't have your own song, nobody else can operate around you. Coordinating other people sounds a little forced, a
Fair
little
enough.
coerced.
Fair enough.
So and maybe some sharp talking is required with different people, but I do think that just
I
to
defer
say,
to
you
you.
just tell us what you want to do.
Yeah.
We can all either help you or tell you that we can't help you, but at least we can participate in some way, even if to say we can't participate.
I defer to you on that. Absolutely. You are the only academic that I have seen actually address this issue. Looking at California as a whole, I've seen LA do it. I've seen San Francisco do it. I've never seen somebody say California as a whole and let's have a thing. I think since James O. Goldsboro wrote in Foreign Affairs in 1999 that there should be a California foreign policy.
Yep. I assigned that reading to my students, and they loved it on the grounds that they thought it was about California being a player on the global stage. They love the reading, and it is a question of what you actually mean when you say foreign policy.
Yeah, James reviewed my book and said it was interesting, and I too wrote about international politics with California. But you're the first professor, academic with a background saying, folks, we need to coordinate or something, whatever the right term is. We're stumbling into affecting the world scene and international relations, but stumbling is the key word. I completely agree with you, and I'm just glad that somebody's actually studying this. I mean, that article came out 20 years ago. This, frankly, should have been done beforehand. I would like to ask you a question, though. So you mentioned Abraham Lowenthal in New Globalism, an open letter to California's governor. Abraham Lowenthal wrote the book, Global California, Rising to the Cosmopolitan Challenge. He said that California was held back to the tune of possibly losing billions of dollars of trade because the federal government wasn't as responsive as we needed. We always had to get permission from them. They would take forever. I remember Governor Schwarzenegger criticizing both Barack Obama and George W. Bush, Republican and Democrat, for holding up our trade deals. And then when we talk about the money that California makes, you're absolutely right. We are in debt. But when you look at the debt, California actually has a lower per capita debt ratio than America. And California is a donor state. In 2014, we lost 1%, but in the 1990s, we lost damn near 15%. It fluctuates from 13 billion, I think, a few years ago to $100 billion in losses. How much is the federal government getting in our way on a policy level and a financial level from being, just as super great as possibly we could be?
Well, being part of any union will at some point stop you from being as super great as you can be, and at other times it's going to save your butt. And I think that that's an important part of why you're in a union at all, is are we greater together by having some things that we share and things that we can do together, and using that collaborative power, is the sum the greater than our part? Or should one part pull out of the rest and say, stuff you guys? And that's every union that has ever been made between individuals to countries to NATO to the UN is the question of, can I do something more productive with these other people than I could do on my own or with this smaller subset? And
Right.
and it's a constant challenge, balance question.
Right.
And so you could answer the question today, Friday, and I might give you a different answer next Wednesday.
Fair enough.
The dot-com bubble can blow up, and we're all in trouble. But one of the things that does make California more state-like, in capital S state, than many other places is the fact that our economy is incredibly diverse. Many other states in the Union of the United States have a much more mono type economy. They have fewer industries. They don't have as many industries. They aren't as big. They are much more dependent on a specific, we are a coal mining state, and therefore if coal goes
Right.
belly up, we are basically a coal mining state.
Yeah.
And so I think the diversification of the economies of other states, which has been part of what globalization has done to those other states, and not least things like climate change or activism around issues like dirty coal or whatever, has meant that other states have also tried to diversify. But because we're so ginormous as a state, we kind of accidentally almost end up with many, many different industries. And that makes us more country-like than many, many other states in the United States. And I think that that's a sort of a luxury. On the other hand, there are some states that absolutely, some industries that do really can fluctuate us pretty quickly. You mentioned bad years for California. Obviously, technology, those kinds of issues, those kinds of companies make very bad headlines for California's state of play. But it's not it has a bit more cushion than places which has only one industry if that industry happens to go.
Oh,
and
yes.
Has many different struggles. So ironically, the size of the state and the number of the industries within the state and the size of each one of them, it's not that one is wildly ahead of all of them. It's sort of they're a bit more evenly balanced. Then I think that means that California is an interesting question of how strong and stable is our economy, assuming that being a diversified economy makes you slightly more stable, or at least able to withstand tides and insecurities that are out there in the system. And I think that does speak well to California's ability to come back from bad moments.
Well, I have to say, though, Abraham Lowenthal, Global California, you reference his book. He said our economy is not doing as well as it could because of federal interference.
No, and I wouldn't disagree with it. But as I say, I could make all kinds of arguments about whether or not lots of partnerships that I join slow me down. The question is whether or not the benefits of being slowed down in some ways are outweighed by being part of the collective in others.
Fair enough.
It's a very individualist perspective to say that, in fact, I would only ever get the benefits if I pulled out. No, actually, you'd also get the really crappy stuff that came with it. Sometimes it's good to be in, and sometimes it's good to be out.
Yeah, I recall when North Korea threatened to blow up America, and they showed a map saying that their missile can now reach California. And then I remember the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist attacks caused by the war in Iraq and Afghanistan that Californians opposed, where Californians were killed. I mean, there's certainly some being part of this association that seems to bring problems to us, problems that we did not sign on for. Is that fair?
And you don't think that California would have enemies if it were separate? You don't think that we're still rich Americans by standards of other people in the world?
Well, I would bring up what you had said.
You don't think we're smug and all kinds of things that they wouldn't like anyway? I can imagine there have been lots of cyber attacks on Hollywood because our movies are bringing horrible American culture to places that don't want our horrible American culture. I can see Hollywood being at the top of somebody's list to blow up.
Certainly. But you had mentioned that many of your students travel around the world and they say, I'm a Californian and get treated better than when they say I'm an American. That seems to be
and
an
I think that
indication.
that's something that the diplomats absolutely recognize. Several of them that I spoke to said that the soft power of California is something that it actually has not ever capitalized on. It is not actually ever maximized.
Interesting.
So their view, again, from other parts of the world, are that California, the things that are in California, are often the things that outsiders associate as being American. So if you say it's a kind of interesting coastal thing, right? America, the United States, I sort of think more government, Washington. But if I say California, I'm like, oh yeah, like beaches and movies and
Yes.
cool, fun, hip stuff, man.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that it's the association of being American, but not the rigid part of foreign policy America, but the kind of cool hip version is the soft power side. But for the United States, the soft power of America is part and parcel of being American. Like in a perception way, being American or from the United States has more of, I think, an officially kind of view, whereas California is the more relaxed view of being American. But when it really came down to it, those people would still know you're American, even if you said California. They might not dislike you as much as if you said, make America great again, but they would certainly have a sense of your Americanness fast enough if that came down to it.
Interesting.
You're still, and being a separate country, I can imagine, everybody makes their own enemies. I'll bet Luxembourg has enemies. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I bet the minute you start actually taking actions that aren't under the umbrella of somebody else, you will have to stand on the basis of those decisions.
Sure.
And you will be popular or unpopular on that basis.
Sure.
And California, I'm sure, would make some pretty interesting enemies.
Absolutely it would, but wow, when you look at how many people America's upset and you compare it to Canada, it is a huge jump off in the number of people who want to put a target on our back.
Canada's not a hegemon.
Yeah, exactly.
It's being a hegemon's hard. I actually feel sorry for hegemons. I think they've got a tough job. China's a hegemon in Asia. The UK used to be a hegemon in Europe. A lot of being a hegemon's not an easy job. I find it, the idea that somehow you're supposed to police everybody else, that automatically puts you in the crummy camp. I mean, it means that you're...
Right.
And you almost have to put yourself in that camp because you are big enough and powerful enough that people will be coming for you. So to be a hegemon is not an easy job. I'm not being overly sympathetic to a lot of people you might mention, but I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea that running a large place with any kind of sense of order is not an easy challenge to master, and particularly if your economy is struggling or the issues that you might be facing from your next door neighbors, it's a difficult thing to try and manage, govern, be responsible well. And I think that California would be suddenly it would be the fifth largest economy, but it would be a small player. It doesn't have a diplomatic corps. It doesn't have sudden group of people who could go out and be their ambassadors and diplomats and whatever. So they would be a punky little middle power in many ways.
While they built up the infrastructure, you're saying that if tomorrow, poof, they're a nation, they don't have the infrastructure to operate.
I actually also think that they would be, Canada's actually just got a lot of size, way more than California, and they're still a middle power.
Right.
And they've got a fascinating system of their provinces and provincial presidents that make their subnationals more powerful than California.
Well, let me ask you, if let's go back to 2005, Governor Schwarzenegger says, I want to make climate change my issue. And he worked with Californians. And I think within about 1 to 2 years, they had gotten 35 countries and 1,000 experts from around the world to meet. And they did such a good job that the president, Ban Ki-moon of the UN, said, you did a better job getting the world to move on climate change than us. They managed to pull that infrastructure together in 2 years. Is that indicative of what California could do, let's say, if it wanted to create this diplomatic corps, and how quickly it could move, theoretically?
Theoretically, when you focus on one issue, I could be a genius if I do nothing but focus on one thing.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
And
Fair
I
enough.
think that makes it that is the challenge of running something bigger. And that's what I mean about I have sympathy for hegemons. I have sympathy for huge powers who are trying to keep a lot of things in the air simultaneously. And
Mm.
and then toss on a few grenades of other issues, other countries, industry fluctuations, markets of different kinds. I think that it's a real problem for how you try and judge one thing against another. And I think that that's the problem of trying to isolate it and say that I get to take all the good stuff and I don't have to take any of the bad stuff. I don't have
Right.
to do anything that I don't want to do. I get to work on just what I want to work on. That's
Right.
not how government works. You don't get to pick the stuff you want to work on. You pick the stuff that you have to get done to take care of your constituents.
I certainly agree. I just keep seeing California seem to butt heads with the federal government. You know, I remember George W. Bush was around. He said, you don't get to do stem cell research. California said, we're going to do our own. They passed a law in violation of the feds and then funded it. And then we fast forward and now we're saying, we want to do our own air quality regulation. We want to do our own marijuana regulation, our own undocumented cities immigration, maybe looking at guns, maybe looking at internet privacy. And I don't recall California pushing for so many different policies against the feds 20 years ago. Are we moving to a point
I
where
don't recall so many things about national domestic politics as there are right now. I could make that
thank
case.
you.
Like I have never seen the division between different levels of government as starkly exposed. I think that we are in a new era of politics. This is a strange new place in politics. So I would never say never about politics ever. So we are in a new era that I'm not sure we all understand. And what I keep trying to tell my students is the understanding of what the word global really means is we're still learning how we keep peeling away the different layers of the onion of how many things that has affected. And it keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. Just when we think we knew what it meant, it goes another level and another layer and another way of playing itself out in the way we govern ourselves and what we think is a good society. And so we're not there yet. So do I think that this is the slow evolution of a California that can build the infrastructure and take on the issues and do the work and create a diplomatic corps and do all the kinds of things that would mean that it could step off the platform and become its own thing? Maybe. I don't know. But would I say tomorrow we should do this, or because we don't like the outcome of the 2020 election or whatever, is a different question than can we do it? Like,
Right.
don't
Right.
don't wish for something that will be basically self-harming.
Right.
You know, if you want to prepare for something like that, then and evolution works that way, right?
Yeah.
That's how evolution works. But the other quote that you didn't mention in the article was that revolutions rarely end well. They
Sure.
rarely end with the outcomes that the revolutionaries hoped for or designed.
Fair
They
enough.
often end up with tragedy and at least a lost generation of people who were sucked into a maelstrom of political unrest. And so therefore, I think if you can do a very slow kind of evolution with going pop at some point, then you've done a great job at evolution, and then you've actually managed to continue to make progress and not having to take a 20-year detour because you decided that you wanted to push the accelerator too fast. And I think that's where, in in terms of how subnational diplomacy is working, how subnational secessionist movements around the world are operating. I think that that's why international relations has got to get its head around the idea that there are different kinds of sovereignty, different sovereigns, and how do we have parallel sovereignties that can operate in the same spaces, but understanding that your job is your job, my job is my job, but gosh, wouldn't it be better if we actually could make sure that they had the connections between these ideas so that we were not constantly butting heads. What I call in my book project and the research that you're referring to is this vertical axis of diplomacy. And the state is at this kind of intersecting line, but the counties, the cities, the tribes, the state like California, the national level, the international level, intergovernmental organizations are all in this vertical axis. If you could take a core sample, we have to get out of the silos that say city goes to the UN, the
Right.
tribes go to the UN. There's so many different straight lines, and California could take such a wonderful cross-section and be a power for real progress, I think, in terms of what it means to be global. And I think we have to really work on what that means. And I think that diversity, and that's why California, I think, is well placed. Because if we don't get that it is wrapped up in the whole idea of how does diversity become unity, not diversity becomes division. California is so well placed to have something to say about that. And that's what I think the next move to being global will look like. And so that's my hope in the great theory world. In the practical world, I just think it's inefficient. So
Okay. As we're winding down, I want to
yes,
ask you some.
yes. We have to soon. Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm going to ask. This is the lightning round. I ask you some controversial questions. You don't have to answer. Um, this is the option I always give people, but we do interviews with many professors who study political division and the future of independent states. Recently, we talked to F.H. Buckley, who has a new book out. He was the former transition organizer for Donald Trump into the presidency and former speechwriter for Donald Trump. He's writing a book called Secession, where he says, wow, California, you want your own marijuana, undocumented, climate change, air quality, dog collar license? This isn't working. This is not stable. Why don't you do what Canada did, where they say, hey, Quebec, you want things differently? Okay, you're still Canada, but you get some, I think the term is asymmetrical federalism,
Yeah.
certain policies for Quebec. Do you see that working in America?
Well, the problem is that Quebec, generally Canada, has an entirely different provincial system. They have a different constitution for a start. So the provinces already have a lot more power than American states.
Okay.
So you have a constitutional, it's like, the problem of just grabbing an example is that, in fact, the basic gearing behind those scenes is not the same gearing.
Right.
Provinces have a completely different constitutional structure and a relationship to the federal government than American states do. This is really obvious, again, talking to my diplomatic counterparts, colleagues, interviews, was that during NAFTA, states have very little role in the negotiations. Provincial leaders absolutely have a role and a specified role because it's in their competence. Now, they don't get to go do the negotiations, but their lobbying of governors across the line was actually an education exercise. They would come across to their next-door neighbor, south or north of the border, depending on which country you were from, Canada or Mexico, and you actually had to take the American state governors through a lot of, like, do you know what this will do to your state? Are you, because of course American governors don't have those powers or don't have that insight into those levels of negotiation. And so it really came down to consuls general and provincial leaders of these other countries to come to the, Arizona or, Washington State or whatever to say, do you understand what this will do? Like, can we help you? Can we educate you? And then they would ask the governors to go tell the president what they needed. Like, do you know what this will do to my economy? Have you thought about what will it do to the cross-border trade? Have you thought what it will do to the jobs that people cross the border every day? And that was an education exercise. So the idea of, like, yeah, you can go be like Quebec, yeah, or like Scotland, or like a whole bunch of places where they have a different kind of federal structure. And the history of those nations has a different background. And because California was never a nation, and it actually it evolved out of very different kinds of law, which is again why tribes here have a very different history. By the time California was basically formed as a state, the United States government had stopped making treaties, back to that magic word, with tribes. That's why tribal issues in California are very different than they are in Connecticut.
Right.
So there's a whole different history of sovereignty and how the United States both treated tribes, but also how it was getting other empires out of its way to take California. Those histories have shaped part of the story of California, and it means that we're not like Quebec or even British Columbia.
Absolutely, absolutely. He was from Canada. He taught there, and he taught at New York, so he was suggesting that. He did say, though, that he thought conservatives in America, namely as we're seeing right now with the Kavanaugh nomination and the impeachment trial of Trump, a majority of them are conservative. And he was saying he doesn't think many of them have that great an opinion of us Californians. And if there was some way to negotiate with them, with like, California, just we're tired of hearing about you want your own climate change. Just take it so that we don't argue as much. He felt that politically he might be able to convince a majority of those conservative states, which would be a controlling majority in the Senate, to allow some sort of amendment to the Constitution to allow that. Is that just fantasy?
Oh, sure. Who wouldn't want to get rid of the problem child?
Oh, wow.
But
that is not the answer I was expecting. Okay.
No, but I mean, well, I can see why I could go make an argument. It's not a, it's not a shocking argument to say I could go talk to a bunch of conservatives about how cool would it be if we didn't have to say that, California wasn't part of us. Then Texas would get to be the big cool kid. Texas would be, they're right behind California on a lot of these issues.
Okay.
Texas would end up being the biggest, coolest, meanest, baddest state in the union. And it would probably make a lot of conservatives happy. But that is a recipe for saying, well, I actually don't like that part of our city. So how about we just exile them and
Right.
make them pay for themselves and deal with themselves?
Right.
Alone and separately. That's a very dangerous idea. It's like, well, you know what? Actually, I don't like that group of people. How about we exile them and make them take care of themselves and get rid of, how do we corral them all here in this area and make them all just live alone and separately from us because we don't like them anymore? That's
Fair
a political equation to some very difficult and problematic solutions to problems that I don't think are actually as problematic.
Fair.
In what should be in a democratic, responsible society.
So highly dangerous, but possible. Okay, let me ask you about one.
Well, no, I can certainly see them going to have the conversation. I'm not sure it would actually work, and I'm not sure that's the right solution. But I can sort of, I don't know what conservatives sit around in bars and talk about over single malt. I don't know what they talk about, and I'm sure that you might be able to say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could just get rid of that state that seems to be such a pain? But I don't think they would actually want to do that because, in fact, we are the fifth largest economy in the world as the state of California. And somebody will go, but Joe, Fred, Sam, whoever, this is not a good idea for the economy of the United States. What happens to the United States economy if you take California's economy out of it completely?
Oh yeah. But
I'm not sure actually that he would be able to win the argument. I can see him making the argument, but I can't see him winning.
It'll be a combination between the conservatives who admit they need us and what I gotta tell you I see on every single Facebook post, Fox News, Breitbart article, which is it's not true. I saw a Houston radio station say this last week. They believe that they support California, that we are a welfare state and that we suck finances from them and that we are not a donor state. Now that's not true, but wow,
that's
do they have them believing it?
But that's what every American believes about aid in the world. By the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So of course everybody believes the best narrative about themselves.
So if they believe that, then maybe they would ignorantly vote for it because that's the worldview they have, even though it's not accurate.
But it's as I say, everybody thinks the United States is always supporting the rest of the world, and we're like everybody's leaning on us. It's like actually no. I'm sorry, our USAID budget is not anything like other countries in the world.
Thank you. Okay, last controversial question, and I'll let you go. And thank you so much, Professor. We talked to Professor Jonathan Taplin, Dean of the USC Communication School, Annenberg, about something that's happening. Now, recently, while we in California are talking about Trump and how bad he is, he's got to go, um, he has been replacing Supreme Court justices with conservatives and circuit court justices with conservatives. And for the first time, it's possible Donald Trump is 2 judges away from the Ninth Circuit Court, which oversees all California, from making it conservative. That would be the first time that the Ninth Circuit Court, which can shut down California laws, would be conservative since the 1970s or half a century ago. If that court becomes conservative and Californians don't get to have progressive legislation as they've enjoyed for the last 50 years, what do you think happens, Professor?
Well, I think you have just officially strayed into the grounds of American politics where I do not go.
Fair enough.
I,
Good
I
answer.
can
Good answer.
happily do international relations theory. I can talk sovereignty. I can talk a bit of California, but you have just strayed well into American politics.
Okay, touche. Well played. Well played. I yield to you. I'm doing a professional curtsy right now. Well played. Professor, comments, thoughts, feelings. How can people get a hold of you if you want them to? What is it? The websites you like them to see? And my favorite question. They're listening to this, and they're going to be thinking about it. What is the thought you want them to have in their head that they just can't stop thinking about?
That the thought to keep thinking about is, what does it really mean to be global? And I think that we have not yet worked out the definition. We have used a lot of terms like postmodern, post-constructivism, post all kinds of things, post-toasties, whatever. But I think that we have not yet worked out the definition, either in terms of what we want it to mean and what it actually has begun to mean on the ground. I am always interested in theory, but I am equally interested in practice, having done IR as an academic pursuit, but also having worked in an embassy, having worked in British politics for a decade. I see that our ideas connect to what we do. What we believe leads us to take actions. Our worldview shapes how we think we can change the world and what levers we think we should get our hands on to make that change. And I think as we continue to keep working out what it is to be on this planet without blowing it up, or destroying it one way or another, is really wrestling with that question, because what I really think it does mean is this idea of how do we let people be in their spaces and places, and how do we still operate together as a collective. It's the challenge that the Founding Fathers tried to work out through checks and balances by saying we believe in individual rights, but we believe that actually we should be checked and balanced by other powers and other people who have different interests at the forefront of their mind. And I think that is our biggest issue, not just in the United States or in California, but the world, of how do we honor, respect, find a way to rub along with all of the people who are on this wonderful planet, but how do we do that both as individuals and collectives? What is the structure agency debate of the next generation? I tell my students that it's really about, it's going to be around the issues of culture and how do we try and recognize and identify, but also how do we work together, because we can't go further and further down the line of the separateness, because we still have to. I used to work when Patty Ashdown was the leader of the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom, a man I worked for a decade and respected a great deal. He made a great observation that what globalization really means at the end of the day is that I share a destiny with my enemy. And until we work out that our destiny is a shared one, then I worry that globalization will mean more and more erosion of basic freedoms and tolerance. And we have to recognize that we share a destiny with all of our enemies, local, national, international, and we therefore have to find a way to make those relationships work and to be networked in a way that is productive and I hope progressive, but that certainly is not violent and destructive. That's what I hope you take away from the idea of how this is all connected. I tell my students all the time, it's all connected and it's all complicated. And that's what we have to work at.
Yes. Okay, well, that is Alison Holmes, a professor at the Humboldt Department of Political Science. She has a presentation on YouTube. Just Google California as a nation state, innovative or inevitable. Also, see the professor's essay, New Globalism, an open letter to California's new governor, and her article where she was interviewed, Professor Ponders California Independent Future, all in 2019. Busy year for you, Professor.
Busy
2019.
year. Hopefully, I'll have a book coming out this year, so you can keep an eye out for all the work that I've done, and as it should be coming out in book form, hopefully this year. But it might end up falling into next year's publication date. But we're working on it, and hopefully there'll be more. There'll be more to come.
Thank you, Professor. I will send a copy of this to you within the next 3 days.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.